As he jogged to catch up to Major Nichols, who was walking toward what looked like some sort of administration building toward the end, "We are now prepared to obliterate more rapidly and completely every productive enterprise the Japanese have above ground in any city. We shall destroy their docks, their factories, and their communications. Let there be no mistake, we shall completely destroy Japan's power to make war." It was to spare the Japanese people from utter destruction that the ultimatum of July 26th was issued at Potsdam. Their leaders promptly rejected that ultimatum. If they do not now accept our terms, they may expect a rain of ruin from the air, the like of which has never been seen on this earth. It is an atomic bomb. It is a harnessing of the basic power of the universe. The force from which the sun draws its power has been loosed against those who brought war to the Far East. The words hovered over him like scavenging birds awaiting death. The power of the sun had been turned against the land of the sun. Sighing deeply, he looked through the exquisitely draped window into the hollow night of the future. August 12, 1945. OSS Headquarters, Kunming, China. "We've gotten word from Washington that the Japs are going to surrender soon," said Colonel Bill Pears, the tall OSS officer, to his group of 7 volunteers, standing and sitting on tables and chairs. Dick Hamada, a 23-year-old bilingual sergeant, eyed the map behind Colonel Pears. The open windows of the clapboard building gave him little relief from the oppressive heat. "Your team is going to be dropped into the area of Peking to get as many American POWs out of the hands of the Japanese before they can do anything to them in retaliation. You know, one last act of revenge for the Emperor." Yeah, Nichols said. "You told us 50 times. General Weddermeyer's given us carte blanche to do whatever's necessary to get our boys out." Heading the team was Major Ray Nichols, a fearless bear of a man from Alabama. Also attached was a doctor, 2 Chinese interpreters, a radio operator, and another officer. Located in far south-central China, only 150 miles north of the border with French Indochina, the city of Kunming was a major hub of Allied activity and cooperation between the Chinese and American military for operations of all kinds in China and Burma. During 1941 and 1942, the airfield had been home to 2 squadrons of the famed American volunteer group, the Flying Tigers. Dick examined the smattering of large black pins on the map dotting China, Korea, and parts of Southeast Asia, all identified prison camps. He was born in Hawaii, the 3rd of 4 children of Japanese immigrants from Hiroshima. As an interpreter for the OSS, like other members of the team, he'd written off his life when he began working behind enemy lines. He felt this next job would be his last one, live or die. He chose to risk his life for the chance to see any of the starved, tortured men make it back home again, alive. "Some months back," Colonel Pears continued, "we inserted a 3-man team of Chinese into Peking." He turned and pointed to the city on the map behind him. "For a long time we didn't hear a word. A few weeks ago they sent a message. They'd located a large POW camp in Fengtai, about 4 miles southwest of the city of Peking, and they've got details of another military jail inside the city they believe has some of our men, prison number 1407. He pointed down to their city of Kunming and followed a red tape marker across the map. "A C-4734 will fly you from where we are here in Kunming to Chongqing, to Xi'an, and then to Peking, 300 miles in all." The colonel looked back at them soberly. "It'll take a couple of days to get there. Your job is to check out the rumours about our boys in Peking and see how many you can spring from the camps before they get shot or have their heads chopped off, and bring them home, alive." Colonel Pears lifted 2 drab-green duffel bags, dropped them on a table beside them, and zipped one of them open. "You'll have 3 pistols each," he said, as he held up a couple of M1911 45s in one hand. "Enough to get you out of a pinch, but that's about it." In the other hand, he displayed a carton of Lucky Strike cigarettes. "We'll give you whatever you need to negotiate and get the job done." Then he dumped onto the table 2 handfuls of banded packs of $20 bills. Dick had seen a lot of unusual things before, but even this made his eyes pop. Work real carefully and diplomatically, but be strong and forceful. Well, what do you want? Nichols said. Strong and forceful, or careful and diplomatic? Never mind. Just play it by ear and be strong and diplomatic. You'll each get $10,000 cash, except for Major Nichols here, who's heading the team. He'll have $50,000. Don't spend it all in one place. Dick smiled with the small break of levity in the otherwise serious room. It'll be a daytime parachute drop onto an airfield outside the city. The Japs are well armed and may very well ignore any orders they may get from Tokyo to quit fighting. Colonel Pears put both hands on his hips as the men huddled close and inspected their bags. Listen, fellas, the big thing is, those are guys who fought at Wake, Bataan and Malaya, even some Doolittle raiders. They're starving, they've been tortured, and the Japs have been threatening to kill 'em rather than let 'em go. So do your best to get 'em home. Major Nichols rubbed his cheek. When do we leave? Tomorrow morning, Pears replied. Early. Dick wasn't prepared for that, but decided he was ready. 12 p.m. noon, August 15th, 1945. Yokosuka, Japan. Uchida stood crisply at attention among the perfectly ordered rank and file of officers at the combined fleet headquarters on the courtyard behind the main building. Their commanding officer faced the men between 2 loudspeakers on stands at opposite corners. Only 3 days earlier, Fuchida had thrown in his lot to join a coup d'etat to overthrow the emperor and force a military rule to avoid surrender to the Americans, something worse than death to him and to most of the military. Yet, when confronted by Prince Takamatsu, a younger brother of Emperor Hirohito and, coincidentally, a fellow classmate of his from Etajima, and taken aside in person, Fuchida relented upon hearing that the emperor earnestly desired surrender in order to secure peace for the nation. That morning, the leader of the coup committed suicide, as did a number of other leaders when they learned that the emperor would accept defeat by the Allies. Fuchida resigned himself to the idea that in the same way he had fought in loyalty to the emperor, he would accept surrender in the same spirit of loyalty, however painful and humiliating, and it would be. The speakers crackled as they broadcast the announcement being heard by the entire nation, the first time the people had ever heard the voice of their emperor. To my good and loyal subjects. Every officer immediately snapped into a salute and held throughout the speech. After deeply pondering the general trends of the world and the current conditions of our empire, I intend to effect a conclusion to the present situation by resorting to an extraordinary measure. My subjects, I have ordered the imperial government to inform the 4 governments of the United States, Great Britain, China and the Soviet Union that our empire is willing to accept the provisions of their joint declaration. Kneeling beside a radio with her and Fuchida's 2 children, Haruko's ashen face was to the floor as she wept quietly. Despite the gallantry of our naval and land military forces, the diligence and the public devotion and service of our 100 million people. In a public square, hundreds of people stood with heads hung low. Some stared blankly. Others knelt and wept openly as the broadcast echoed over the crowds. The situation of the war has developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage, while the general trends of the world have all turned against her interest. Inside a meeting room, Genda and officers stood at attention around a long table, staring at each other as a radio sounded out the sombre message. Moreover, the enemy has begun to employ a new and most cruel bomb, the power of which to do damage is, indeed, incalculable. A chef stood still behind the counter as shocked patrons sat listening, their faces in fallen grief, many unable to control their emotions. Should we continue fighting in the war, it would cause not only the complete annihilation of our nation, but also the destruction of human civilization. Without emotion, Amayo sat kneeling in her bedroom listening to a small radio while staring out the window. The thought of our imperial subjects dying on battlefields, sacrificing themselves in the line of duty, of those who died in vain, pains my heart and body night and day. The hardships and sufferings to which our nation is to be subjected hereafter will be certainly great. As the Emperor completed his words, Fuchida and the officers struggled to maintain their composure. I am keenly aware of the feelings of my subjects, but in accordance to the dictates of fate, I am willing to endure the unendurable and tolerate the intolerable to establish peace to last 1,000 generations. The commanding officer signalled the men to end their salute. 1,000 generations? Fuchida wondered. He shook his head. No, there will always be war. August 15th, 1945. Madras, Oregon. The early morning sunlight illuminated the clouds of dust that billowed behind a black Chevy coupe as the bouncing car barreled up the dirt road to the farmhouse. At the wheel, Glenn waved a newspaper outside the window and skidded to a turning stop in front of the house. He leapt out of the car, slammed the door, and held up the newspaper to his stepfather, sitting on the front porch. "You heard! The Japs surrendered! It's over! The war's over! We beat the Japs!" Mr. Andrus stood up just as the screen door swung open and Glenn's mom stepped out. "We heard on the radio this morning," he said, calmly smiling. Glenn bounded up the steps and reached his arms around his mum. "Isn't it great?" "Why, it's wonderful, son," she replied. He looked at his mum's face and realized she couldn't completely celebrate. He glanced over at his stepdad, who raised his eyebrows, then to his mum, whose eyes drifted to the ground as she tried to hide her tears. For her, the war wasn't over. August 17th, 1945. Kure Naval Hospital, 15 miles from Hiroshima. Uchida tried to keep up with a doctor carrying an armful of files as they dodged nurses and patients down a hallway filled with gurneys of countless sick and bandaged people. Fuchida curiously rubbed his chin and wondered what all the fuss was about and why he was nearly commanded to fly down to the hospital. "And you were walking around in the blast site for 3 days?" the doctor queried while glancing at his watch. "Yes, but what was the urgency of me coming down here right away?" The doctor stopped at the doorway of a room and looked at Fuchida, almost in disbelief. "Not just those who survived the blast, but many who were in Hiroshima directly after the blast are dying from some strange disease. We don't really understand it, but we're calling it radiation sickness." The doctor led Fuchida into a room with some of the men he was with in Hiroshima on the day after the blast. The doctor looked at Fuchida's face for his reaction as he spoke. "All these men were with you. They're all dying. Others who were with you are already dead." Fuchida was speechless. "Have you noticed any of your hair coming out? Have you felt sick in any way? Nausea? Anything?" Fuchida slowly shook his head as he painfully studied each of his stricken teammates who stared back in hopelessness. Splotches of red marked many of their faces, hands, and arms. What looked like tumours protruded from some of their faces. Some were completely bald or had only a few, odd clumps of hair left. Others wore bandages soaked with blood. "We'll have to keep you here for observation," the doctor said quickly, again glancing at his watch and making a note in his book. In the last few years, Fuchida knew he could have or should have died on many occasions. At times he even felt guilty for still being alive. He should have been in Hiroshima on the day of the blast. Even though everyone else in his search party was affected, he suffered none of the ill effects any of his fellow officers experienced. Nothing. For the first time he sensed that somehow his life was being preserved by something beyond himself. August 17th, 1945. Peking, China. Dick Hamada sat in the rumbling plane watching airmen pitch handfuls of printed flyers down through a large round hole in the floor of their B-24 Liberator as it circled and made passes over an airfield outside the city. The belly turret had been removed from the four-engine heavy bomber for the literature drop, and for the men to jump from as well. He was surprised that their plane hadn't been intercepted by fighters or even shot at from the ground by anti-aircraft fire. But the idea of blanketing their drop zone with leaflets telling the Japanese soldiers that the war was over, that they shouldn't kill the Americans, and that they should surrender was little comfort. He could see hundreds of armed soldiers on the ground, scurrying and appearing to take positions. He was well aware that their little team would be easy prey once they opened their parachutes. With the last heave of leaflets fluttering to the ground, an airman gave the thumbs up to the rescue team. They'd jump during the next pass over the field. Getting to his feet and holding onto the frame, Dick tightened his harness and checked his gear. As he stood waiting for the timing for their jump, he thought about the letter that each man carried, personally signed on official letterhead from General Wedemeyer, the commanding general of all U.S. forces in China. It firmly commanded that this team represented him and that no harm should come to the men. But one thing concerned Dick. It was written only in English. 15 seconds! An airman yelled over the drone of the four engines. On cue, one at a time, each man dropped through the opening and pulled his ripcord and cascaded into a line of 7 blossoming parachutes swinging slowly in the clear, sunny sky. Looking down from his harness, Dick realized that the fields that were only moments ago swarming with armed men were now vacant, yet he felt 1,000 eyes staring at him. After tumbling to the ground, he unhooked his harness and began rolling up the yards and yards of his silk parachute when the plane made a final pass and dropped several more packages by parachute containing their gear. As he jogged to catch up to Major Nichols, who was walking toward what looked like some sort of administration building toward the end off the airfield, gunshots rang out from the distant bushes, sending bullets whizzing past his head. He pretended to ignore them. What else could he do? There wasn't anywhere to run or hide. If they wanted to kill him, they could easily do it, so Dick figured it was just a warning. Just as suddenly, the rifle fire stopped. He sped up his pace, even with his heavy pack, knowing that he needed to get up to the Major as quickly as possible where he'd be needed. From the opposite direction, he heard the whining of a truck's shifting gears accelerating quickly. Keeping his quick pace, he looked over his shoulder to see an old troop truck with soldiers standing in the back, holding a huge white flag. When the truck arrived, it circled in front of the men, and a dozen Japanese soldiers with bayoneted rifles poured out, along with a lieutenant in his traditional black boots who quickly blurted out in English, "The war is not over! You must give up your weapons at once!" The soldiers pointed their weapons at the group. Dick looked at Major Nichols. Apparently the Japanese hadn't heard the speech of their emperor, or hadn't received commands to surrender from headquarters, or they had simply chosen to ignore it all and chosen to continue to fight on. The Major gave a confident nod and replied in his deep drawl, "I'm Major Nichols of the United States Army. We are not giving up our weapons, and we demand to be taken to your commanding officer immediately." The Major knew that any sign of weakness could mean the end of the mission and their lives. The two locked eyes. Both the American Major and the Japanese lieutenant held strong and weak cards in their hands. For the Japanese lieutenant, he could have all the men killed, and that would be the end of it. He had the upper hand in strength, and there would be no favourable witnesses to the event. For the American Major, he knew that they both knew the war was over, and sooner or later the place would be overrun with Chinese and American soldiers who would demand an account of where the team was. The Japanese lieutenant would most likely be found out. The Japanese lieutenant stared up at the hulking Major. He wasn't sure who held the better cards, but couldn't afford to call his bluff, if that's what it was. He turned to his men and said in Japanese, "Load their equipment into the truck." Then he looked into Major Nichols' face again and said in English, "I will take you to General Takahashi." August 20th, 1945. A strange, brilliant light seemed to shine on Jake's face that morning as he lay on this mat, so bright he couldn't open his eyes. Just as clearly, deep in his spirit, he heard the Lord speaking to him, that his anguish was over, that he'd soon be free and rejoined with his family, and that he was going to be sent back to Japan to help teach people, to teach them a better way to live. He knew it was true. Everything in his being confirmed it. He sat up and opened his eyes to his dark cell, surprised at how much his health had been restored. He felt like a little boy on Christmas morning. Later, the guards led him to a bath area to wash up. As he splashed his face with water under the eyes of a guard, he couldn't help hearing a commotion a ways away, and saw men carrying boxes of documents off behind a concrete wall where a bonfire was sending up plumes of smoke and flakes of ash. He also noticed that the guards had broken out clean, new uniforms. Jake's heart beat with anticipation, a heart that not only beat with new life, but with hope. He had no feelings of hatred toward his captors any longer. None. Waves of love seemed to have swept over him in the preceding days. He couldn't be angry if he wanted to be. Patting his face dry, his joy of being released was tempered by a sadness he felt for the Japanese people. He feared that a spirit of despair could easily come over the nation. Major Nichols's OSS team was packed into a room packed with 15 Japanese officers. He sat at a small table opposite General Takahashi. The record-breaking sweltering heat wasn't the only thing creating a profusion of sweat sopping the shirts of all. "Don't tell me that!" Major Nichols bellowed at the petrified Japanese officer standing near the table. He continued in his Alabama drawl with all the authority of a mother grabbing a child by the scruff of the neck. "I know that, in fact, you're not an officer in the army. You're an interrogator for the police." The major waited for the officer being scolded to give the translation to his commander, even though words seemed almost unnecessary. Dick knew this was a very high-stakes game, where no one could predict the breaking point. He only knew someone and something was going to snap, soon. As the Japanese general nodded, the translator began to sit when Major Nichols glared and shouted so loudly, everyone in the room jumped. "You will not sit down. You will interpret only, and you may not volunteer any information either. Is that understood?" The Japanese officer's hands trembled in fear as he nodded and haltingly gave the translation to his general. Major Nichols leaned back and fanned himself with a soiled folding paper fan, the only air conditioning system in what felt like a sauna, as the sweat trickled down his face, soaking his collar. The general leaned forward, seeking to gain some high ground. "You shouldn't even be here as the war is not officially over. Nothing has been signed yet." As the major listened to Dick translate, he nodded and leaned forward himself, still fluttering his fan. His 6'2" mass was intimidation enough without his speaking a word to the 5'1" general. "Tell the general that we're not asking him to surrender. Yet. And let him know that we know where the prisoners are in the city, how many he has, and that we demand their immediate release." When the officer gave the translation to Takahashi, Dick watched the eyebrows of the general go up and the eyes of the Japanese officers dart back and forth. It was clear that they had all believed that the whereabouts of the Doolittle Raiders was still a complete secret. Lifting his head, General Takahashi said in Japanese, "Tell the major that he has put himself in extreme danger by coming here like this." As soon as Dick completed his English translation, Major Nichols instantly responded, "And tell the general that if he doesn't turn over our prisoners now, he'll be putting himself in extreme danger. He'll be court-martialed and executed." Even as the Japanese translator was finishing, Major Nichols continued, "And tell him we've been waiting for 3 days now, and if I don't get some action real soon, I'm going to belt him in the mouth so hard his teeth are going to come out the back of his neck." But Dick noticed that the Japanese mistranslated the last bit to the general, saying, "He says he is beginning to tire of waiting and is concerned about the health of the prisoners." Dick spoke directly in Japanese to the translator for the first time. "Tell him exactly what he said, or I'll do it for you." The translator swallowed hard, looked at both Dick and the major, then gave the correct translation to the general, who then leaned back, unbuttoned his collar, and wiped his brow with a handkerchief. Major Nichols's eyes drilled into the general as he fanned himself. Then, while keeping his eyes fixed on General Takahashi, Nichols snapped the paper fan shut and slid it to the general, who picked it up, snapped it open, and began fanning himself. Jake heard swift footsteps in the hallway. Then, with a clanking of keys, the metal latch clicked crisply. Sitting on his mat, Jake looked up at the dim light coming from the tiny grate in his door as it creaked open. General Takahashi and Major Nichols stood behind a guard who bowed to Jake. The guard said in English, "War over, go home now." August 21st, 1945. Madras, Oregon. Mrs. Andrus finished up the last morning dish and stacked it in the dish drain while her husband fiddled with a horse halter on the breakfast table as the news sounded over their radio. She'd heard the night before that 4 of the 8 Doolittle raiders had been found in China, but there was no information on their names. As she wiped out a frying pan with a red and white checkered towel, she and her husband stopped as the radio announced, "And from China we have just received news of the 4 surviving Doolittle raiders, who were found and rescued, having endured 40 months of brutal captivity under the Japanese. We now have their names." She felt as though her heart stopped beating and her hands began to tremble. Mr. Andrews sat motionless, staring at the radio. "Their names are Lieutenant Robert Haight, Lieutenant George Barr, Lieutenant Chase Nielsen, and Sergeant Jacob DeShazer. The men are doing fine and are enjoying—" The pan dropped from her hands onto the counter with a clang. She hugged her husband in tears of joy and began dancing in euphoria. "I knew it! Jakey's coming home!" Mr. Andrus stood with a relieved smile as his wife raised her hands and head toward the heavens. "Oh, thank the good Lord in heaven above! My boy is coming home. I knew it." August 31st, 1945. Tateyama Naval Base, Tokyo Bay. Fuchida stood with his hands behind his back on the concrete docks of the Tateyama Naval Base, watching 2 American destroyers unload men into rubber rafts offshore. Fuchida was informed that the base was to be turned over to the Americans that day. As all Japanese military were instructed, the 2 men wore white armbands on their upper left arms to signify they were submitting to Allied rule. Any man without an armband would be suspect for still being in a state of war against the Americans. "Has the base been fully evacuated?" Fuchida said to the officer beside him. "Yes, sir, all but for a few clerks." It had been an exhausting and harrowing 2 weeks for him since the Emperor's speech. He'd hastily written a short pamphlet entitled, "We Believe This," explaining to those tempted to continue the fight that they'd done their best and had nothing to be ashamed of, but that now surrender was the will of the Emperor. It was printed and distributed by the thousands. To help smooth the transition, even members of the imperial family were sent out to encourage compliance. Yet pockets of die-hard soldiers and airmen refused to lay down their arms. Rumours persisted that the Americans would behead all Japanese officers. Aircraft were stolen. Some bases were taken over by militarists or buildings set on fire. Members of the military committed suicide rather than live in defeat. There was still talk of overthrowing the emperor, installing a new government, and rejecting surrender. On one occasion, Fuchida, armed with pistol and sword, had to personally confront a close friend leading a small insurrection, knowing full well that if the friend resisted, he would have to kill him. Fortunately, the man was drunk and delirious at the time. With the help of a few other officers, he was bound and sent to a psychiatric hospital. The formal surrender ceremonies on USS Missouri in the Bay were only 2 days away, and Fuchida's primary responsibilities now were to see that all air bases in the Greater Tokyo area were cleared of military personnel, that all aircraft were disarmed and disabled, and that the air would be free of threats. Others were seeing to the disarming of all soldiers. The officer beside Fuchida leaned toward him with a quizzical look. "What exactly are they doing out there?" Likewise perplexed, Fuchida slowly shook his head. I don't quite understand. He'd expected the ships to pull up the pier and disembark their men, but instead he was looking at 24 rafts being rowed to shore by heavily armed marines. Coming into shallower water, the men jumped in the chest. Deep water held their rifles over their heads and waded in. Finally, the commanding officer climbed up the ladder onto the pier and trudged toward Fuchida, who exercised all of his self-control to keep from laughing. The sopping wet officer, somewhat embarrassed, wrapped in hand grenades and ammo clips, walked up to Fuchida as his boots squeaked from the sloshing water. "Is this a practice maneuver, sir?" Fuchida asked with a straight face. "No, this is a genuine operation," the officer said in frustration. Fuchida couldn't entirely blame him. The Americans didn't know quite what to expect from a nation of kamikaze soldiers willing to die rather than surrender, and Japan was still in a state of disarray. Fuchida watched the other drenched Marines clamber onto shore. "We have hot baths for your men while their clothes dry off." Like a hotel concierge, he swung his arm toward the barracks. "Let me take you." The Marine commander sighed. "Yeah, I think that'd be great." 9 a.m., September 2nd, 1945, Tokyo. The battleship USS Missouri sat proudly in Tokyo Bay, surrounded by 5 other battleships and nearly 200 American warships of every kind. Powerful imagery to the world of total victory. While patrol planes flew overhead, a resourceful photographer positioned his launch to snap a picture of the bow of the Missouri arching high over the iconic Mount Fuji in the distance. Exactly what every American delighted to see on the front page of their newspapers. On board, hundreds of sailors in khaki or white, Marines, journalists, and photographers from around the world cascaded over gun turrets, railings, and filled every conceivable place to sit, stand, climb, or perch for this once-in-a-lifetime historic event. Packed beside Japanese and American reporters on an upper deck, Fuchida looked down on the admirals, generals, colonels, and marshals representing the Allied powers who stood in a tightly packed group on the deck below, referred to as the surrender deck. Earlier that day, Fuchida was preparing transportation for the official Japanese delegation for the ceremony, but the Americans provided a destroyer instead. He and a party of liaison officers came separately shortly after 7:30 a.m., at the same time the many international correspondents and cameramen boarded. Just before 9 a.m., the Japanese delegation, comprising 11 men and representing the Imperial General Staff, the civil government of Japan, the Imperial Army, and the Imperial Navy, walked in a line and formed into 3 rows before a table bearing 2 huge open books, the formal Japanese instrument of surrender. The sun just began to break through the overcast skies when General Douglas MacArthur, Supreme Commander of the Allied Powers, approached the microphone stand. The eyes of all were riveted on his well-known image. In the previous 4 years, Fuchida had experienced excitement, frustration, anger, pride, joy, disgust, fear, despair, sadness, and 1,000 other emotions. Yet now he felt strangely detached as he observed this almost mystical event. MacArthur began in slow, deliberate words that echoed from the ship across the water. As I look back on the long, tortuous trail from those grim days of Bataan and Corregidor, when an entire world lived in fear, when democracy was on the defensive everywhere, when modern civilization trembled in the balance, I thank a merciful God that he has given us the faith, the courage, and the power from which to mould victory. Fuchida was surprised as he was expecting triumphant arrogance from the general. He could have bragged of America's power and victory, but he didn't. "We have known the bitterness of defeat and the exultation of triumph," MacArthur said, "and from both we have learned there can be no turning back. We must go forward to preserve in peace what we have won in war." He looked up momentarily from his written speech at the concerned eyes of the military leaders of the war. Men since the beginning of time have sought peace. Various methods through the ages have attempted to devise an international process to prevent or settle disputes between nations, but military alliances, balances of power, and leagues of nations have all failed, leaving the only path to be by way of the crucible of war. We have had our last chance. If we do not now devise some greater and more equitable system, Armageddon will be at our door. Unconsciously, Fushida nodded in agreement. The problem, basically, is spiritual, and therefore requires a spiritual renewal and improvement of human character that will harmonize with our almost matchless advance in science, art, literature, and with all the material and cultural developments of the past 2,000 years. It must be of the spirit if we are to save the flesh. Let us pray that peace be now restored to the world and that God will preserve it always. Fuchida looked down at his feet, stunned. He was entirely unprepared to hear such humble words from the victorious Supreme Commander of the Allied forces. He knew if the Japanese had won, they would never have spoken to the Americans with such magnanimity. He moved to get a better, full-faced view of MacArthur. "It is my earnest hope," the general slowly said into the microphone, "and indeed the hope of all mankind, that from this solemn occasion a better world shall emerge out of the blood and carnage of the past. A world dedicated to the dignity of man and the fulfillment of his most cherished wish for freedom, tolerance, and justice." Justice? Fuchida wondered as the formal signing began. Whose justice? To him it wasn't justice that had prevailed, it was simply superior power that had prevailed. The Emperor spoke of everlasting peace, and now General MacArthur spoke of peace for God to preserve. He didn't buy it. Peace wasn't coming. More trouble was coming. It's the nature of the world. It's the nature of man himself. He was convinced there would never be peace. September 1945. Madras, Oregon. Jake sat in his army khakis and tie at the dinner table, biting into a thick drumstick, but not chewing or moving. His mom, beaming with joy, stood pouring coffee for him over a table piled high with potato salad, fried chicken, coleslaw, cornbread, and blueberry pie. "That's good," the photographer said. "Hold it just like that. That's perfect." A barrage of flashbulbs popped, and the crowd of cameramen hurried to wind to the next frame to get off another shot. Jake mumbled with the chicken in his teeth. "Is it okay if I eat this now? I'm sure hungry." Upon hearing Chuckles, he took a huge bite and looked up at his proud mom and the rest of his family applauding with cheers. It was still hard for him to believe that only a month earlier he was in solitary confinement facing death by starvation. He was back from the dead. Life had gone from a nightmare to a dream. As he drove his 1940 Pontiac Torpedo coupe down the road, the events of the last few weeks seemed a frenetic blur to him. Military interviews, hospital examinations, days of air travel from China to India, to Europe to New York and Chicago, press conferences, and finally arriving home. Home. It felt good to say that word and to actually be where he'd longed to be for so many, many days. He was really, finally home. But he had business to take care of. Business he knew would be first on his list. Turning up the dirt driveway that ran alongside a post and barbed wire fence, he crackled up the road toward the home of Henry Wheeler, who happened to be outside his barn directing men hauling hay into a loft. Henry turned toward the stopping car and wiped the sweat off his forehead with a handkerchief as Jake, back in civilian clothes, got out and made his way toward him. "Jake," Henry said. "Great to see you, Henry." The two shook hands vigorously, both with painfully big smiles. The rest of the farm hands stopped to admire the local hero. "You're a celebrity now, and to think you once worked for me. Well, you see, Mr. Wheeler, that's what I wanted to talk to you about." Mr. Wheeler winced. "Don't tell me you need a job. I just put on 2. "No, sir. The government's treated me real good. I got all my back pay and just bought me a car, and a newspaper company paid me way too much for my story. But back when I was working for you, Well, I wanted to apologize to you for for stealing some of your tools, and I'd like to make it right." Jake pulled an envelope from his pocket and held it out. Henry looked down at the envelope and held up his hand embarrassingly. "Oh, Jake, you don't need to." "Yeah, I do. That'll cover getting new tools and more. I'm real sorry." Sighing, Henry slowly grasped the envelope, then looked Jake straight in the eyes and paused. "They say you're going to go back to Japan. Is that true, Jake?" "Yes, sir, when I'm ready." Henry tapped the envelope onto his palm a few times while staring at Jake's face, then slowly gave a grin and gentle nod. Jake knew that Henry got it. His job here was done, and it felt good. A few weeks later, soft blue moonlight beaming in from a window blended with the yellow light flooding in through the open door into the Andrus's master bedroom, lighting the collection of press clippings. In the other room, the sounds of family, laughter, and the lingering aroma of food warmed the home with a joy only those who've experienced it can ever comprehend. The wall of newspaper articles graduated from the headlines of "Mother Fears Son Executed by Japs" and "Mrs. Andrus Has Faith, Says Son Is Still Alive" to the newly posted entries of "4 Doolittle Tokyo Raiders Found by Shoot Team in China," "Oregon Doolittle Flyer Comes Home to Mom," and many others, several featuring Jake biting into a piece of fried chicken. At the table crowded with all 4 siblings and their families, his stepfather and neighbours, Jake spoke while holding a half-eaten cob of corn. "So there I was in New York City at some radio station, and I said, 'You got to be kidding me,' for one sentence. People chewed biscuits and chicken as Mrs. Andrus delivered a dish of baked beans while Jake spouted on. 'So I read the sentence over the radio and they paid me $400. $400!' Hoots and hollers rang out with cheers. After the guests had had their fill of ice cream, pie, and tales from Jake's world adventures and the last pair of red tail lights coursed away down the driveway, Jake and his mum sat in rockers on the porch in the cool evening air. They quietly swayed under a huge sky of stars and moonlight, the gold-lit windows highlighting their backs. "I thought, maybe I could serve in Japan," Jake said, "by being a janitor in a church or something. But I felt like the Lord told me to get in and work for all I'm worth." Mrs. Andrus smiled and rocked. "I don't quite know what that means or what I could do," he continued. "But I'm going to go back to school, Ma. Really learn Japanese, get a degree." Her chuckles interrupted his little speech. My. At 33 you'll be the oldest boy in school." Jake hung his head and grinned. "Well, I'm kinda short anyway, so I don't think too many folks'll notice." He looked across the expanse of stars in the sky. "When I was on those planes coming home, I had a lot of time to think about where I've been, what I've done, where I'm going, and where I want to be heading. I told God I'd never smoke another cigarette or drink another drop of alcohol. It's not like I felt I had to, or that it was some big deal. I just want to live clean, shoot for the best." His mum took it all in. She was still in a state of disbelief. Not only had her son come home alive, he was alive in his spirit as well. Jake gave a single chuckle. "Huh. To think, all those years, me and the boys just wanted to get back home. Now all I can think of is getting back to Japan." He looked his mum in the eyes. "Strange, isn't it?" "It is. And all those years we waited and hoped and prayed for you to come home. And now—" Her eyes sparkled as she reached over and put her hand on top of his. "I'm with you all the way, son. I'm with you all the way." Early December 1945. Tokyo. Kneeling beside a charcoal fire heating an iron pot, Haruko folded clothes with Yoshiya and Miyako. Haruko glanced at her son's face as he slowly folded a shirt. She could see a sadness that a boy of 12 wasn't allowed to talk about. She stopped. "What's the matter, Yoshiya?" His little sister stopped and looked at him as well. With his head down, he waited a few seconds. When's Dad coming back home? Is he working somewhere? Haruko forced a smile and finished folding the shirt in front of Yoshia. Your father needs some time to be by himself. He'll be back. Yoshia looked up through his furrowed brow and folded his arms. When? The mountains of Chichibu, 50 miles northwest of Tokyo. The cold crimson sky closed into night over the dense groves of tall Japanese cedar, cypress, and red pines clinging to the rocky mountainsides. A waterfall hissed in the distance. Fuchida, his hair and beard untrimmed since September, sat warming his soiled hands over a fire. The injured tiger had withdrawn into the dark recesses of the forest. Beside him was his only consolation, his German shepherd, Liti. He once clearly knew everything he believed in and where he was going. Now, holed up in an abandoned shack, he wrestled with the voices of the past and echoing questions for which he had no answers. He yanked his overcoat tighter around his neck and exhaled a cloud of vapour as the cold bore down on him. Everything he'd lived for and led others to die for had come to nothing. Worse than nothing. He didn't know what he believed any longer. Picking up a stick, he shoved the burning logs, sending crackling embers into the dark sky. As he stared, he could see the smiling faces at the airbase after his raid on Pearl Harbor chanting his name. Fuchida, Fuchida, Fuchida. Hero. Now he was the villain, the leader of the attack on a day that will live in infamy. Infamy. The things he'd spent his entire life on had only ruined the nation he loved and helped destroy an entire generation. Liti muzzled her cold nose against Fuchida's leg. Looking down at her glimmering brown eyes, he gently ran his hand over her head. "What have I done?" he whispered. Then the words of the Emperor came to him. To establish a peace to last 1,000 generations. But all Fuchida had seen was war and more war. What did the Emperor know of peace? MacArthur, despite his proud posture and reputation, had surprised Fuchida with his humble, penetrating words, which now lingered in his mind. Methods for peace have all failed. We have had our last chance. Armageddon will be at our door. The problem is spiritual. The problem seemed clear, but what was the solution? Yamamoto died a noble warrior's death, and Nagumo took his own life, as many of Fuchida's own fellow officers had done. Staring distantly into the flaming embers, he almost felt abandoned in life by those who had entered death, left behind to face the lifelong shame and torment of defeat. Perhaps, he thought, it would be best if he followed them. Fuchida lay back against the ground with his hands behind his head, gazing into the early night sky, watching the smoke drift upwards lit by the flickering flames below. The impassioned plea of the old woman from Hiroshima came to his mind. Now, where will you lead us? Where do we go now? He sighed in angry frustration. For the first time in his life, he was completely without direction. Liti pressed her muzzle against him and licked his hand. 3 weeks later. Yokosuka Naval Base, Tokyo Bay. Leaning up and back in the office, Fuchida dressed in civilian clothes since the military was now disbanded. He vigorously made notes on a pad at his desk behind large glass windows, separating him from a room full of desks and busy clerks, all men. A fellow ex-officer stepped into Fuchida's office, dropped some folders on the corner of his desk, pulled a cigarette from his mouth, and eased into a chair. Another war crimes trial? Fuchida didn't look up. More like a mockery of justice, Rear Admiral Okada. Fuchida laid his pencil down and glanced up. He captained the heavy cruiser Tone when we went to Pearl Harbor. Later, he was the commander of our naval base at Ambon, which included a prisoner of war camp. Fuchida angrily tore the page off the pad and inserted it into a folder. The ex-officer blew smoke and snubbed the butt of his cigarette, waiting for the rest of the story. He's been charged with being responsible for the deaths of some prisoners, even though he had nothing to do with it. And you're being called to testify? Fuchida opened another folder. I don't know. I have to be there, though, because I know him well. A strikingly beautiful woman appeared in the doorway with a tray of handmade confections, startling both of them. "Senbei? Wagashi?" she said with a smile. Fuchida raised his hand to wave off the gift. "Oh, I couldn't," she responded with a pretend frown. "But I made them myself for the office." Glancing to the other ex-officer, Fuchida nodded. "One of each, then. Thank you so much." The other man likewise nodded and helped himself to one of each. "Thank you." "You let me know if you want some more. Don't be shy, okay?" she said with a smile. The two men nodded like boys to their mother as they each took bites and allowed their eyes to follow her outside the office to the desk of another staff member, where she bent over and offered her treats once again. Fuchida whispered, "Wow." "Yeah," the other man replied, still staring. "That's what her fiancé said when he first saw her." Abruptly shaking his head, Fuchida looked at his watch, then at the ex-officer. "My plane leaves in 2 days for Rabaul. I need to get back to work." The ex-officer stood up. "Sure." As Fuchida ran his hand over a sheet in his folder, he looked up again through the glass window at the woman, who glanced back with a smile. January 1946. Rabaul, New Britain, the Australian territory of New Guinea. A squad of Australian military police cordoned off a weathered wooden schoolhouse flying an Australian flag under a cloudless, burning sky. Only 300 miles south of the equator, the schoolroom overflowed with perspiring Australian soldiers at the perimeter, and seated and standing reporters, civilians, witnesses from Japan, journalists, photographers, and diplomats, all present for the trial of Fuchida's friend, Rear Admiral Okada, now in full swing. Dressed in a white civilian suit and tie in the front row of the gallery, Fuchida sat waving a fan to ward off the stifling heat and humidity, but unable to cool the intensity of the trial. He came as both an observer and as a possible witness, and shook his head with disapproval as he studied the judges. At the head of the makeshift courtroom on a raised platform sat the head judge, or president, a lieutenant colonel with salt and pepper hair and a waxed moustache. He was flanked by 2 majors, all wearing translator headphones and seated beneath the British Royal Coat of Arms banner on the wall behind them, crossed by 2 Australian flags on poles. Fuchida expected no sympathy from them. The Australian prosecutor paced before the Japanese witness, Captain Shirozu, seated with folded arms behind a wide table strewn with papers. The prosecutor spoke in respectable Japanese. "And the 4 listed prisoners were guilty of stealing rations and the 5th prisoner of attempting escape, is that correct?" Shirozu nodded. "That's right." The head judge adjusted his headphones. The prosecutor leaned on the table with both hands. "And ordered to be executed for these offences, is that correct?" "Those were the orders." "How were those orders carried out?" Shirozu paused, looking at the floor, then looked up. 4 of the prisoners were bayoneted, the 4th was decapitated. The prosecutor glanced to see the expression on the judges' faces. "Were those orders given to you in official papers?" "No, I received them by telephone from Captain Kawasaki." Fuchida looked to the ceiling with impatient eyes. Standing upright, the prosecutor continued. "Did you know that under Japanese law prisoners of war had to be court-martialed before being executed?" "Yes, I knew that," Shirozu said matter-of-factly. "Wasn't it your duty to send these prisoners to be court-martialed first?" "It was not my duty." "Then, whose duty was it?" Shirozu turned his head toward a man in a khaki jumpsuit with a large letter P stenciled on his shoulders and knees. P standing for prisoner. "I believe that was the duty of the commander of the 25 Naval Base Force." He looked back to the prosecutor. "Rear Admiral Okada." All eyes in the room turned toward Okada. Fuchida fanned harder. He'd seen this before. Both Shirozu and Kawasaki were clearly involved, had conflicts of interest, and were doing little more than shifting blame upwards until there was nowhere else to shift it. The last man in line got the axe. The prosecutor studied papers in his hand, then let his arm swing to his side as he addressed Okada, now seated behind the table. Do you think the execution of a prisoner of war who has committed a crime, without a due trial, is a lawful homicide? No, Okada said plainly in Japanese. It is absolutely not lawful. And you agree that all lawful orders from the headquarters originated from you? That is correct. And you always maintained strict discipline and order of the forces under your command? Yes, I maintained a strict chain of command. Fuchida was engrossed. Regardless of being in the role of a defeated enemy, he'd seen Japan receive at least an attempt of some form of justice from the military courts, although it always seemed slanted against the Japanese. Okada had been given a capable defense attorney and was allowed to submit a 16-page plea of innocence to the judge, fully translated and typed in English. Fuchida held out hope that somehow Okada would be vindicated, however distant it seemed. Captain Shirozu testified that orders from headquarters were given for the execution of the prisoners through Captain Kawasaki, who is now deceased. Did you give these orders, or did you delegate that authority to Captain Shirozu? Neither. I was not consulted in the matter. Fuchida sucked air through his teeth. This was the critical point of the trial. Okada swore to him that he never gave an order for the prisoners to be killed, so either someone in the courtroom was lying or Kawasaki lied. Fuchida believed in his friend, granting the fact that it would be extraordinary for Okada to be that far removed from an order for execution. So, the prosecutor said, allowing himself a sarcastic grin, we are to believe that you knew nothing about a matter of this importance, that you gave no orders, and that subordinates acted on their own, completely contradicting your testimony of strict discipline and chain of command. Okada looked directly into the prosecutor's eyes and thought for a moment. I should have been consulted, but I was not. After a short break in the trial, the judge tapped his gavel as people took their seats, and a hush quickly spread across the broiling courtroom. He cleared his throat and looked through his reading glasses at the sheet of paper in his aged hands. Journalists grabbed their pads. Hand-held fans fluttered throughout the room. Sitting on the edge of his seat, Fuchida leaned forward. He was convinced that no civilian court of law would convict anyone on such insignificant and sometimes contradictory circumstantial evidence. But this was a military court that ruled in the eyes of an angry world who wanted justice for untold bloodshed among thousands of prisoners who were grossly mistreated, left to die, or killed. Justice, or maybe revenge. Sympathy for the defeated foe simply wasn't a consideration. The judge spoke in his Australian English as Okada listened to a translation via headphones. In regards to the Australian War Crimes Trial number 2963, Rear Admiral Okada Temitsugu and the cases of the 5 named Australian prisoners of war, this court finds the accused guilty of all charges of committing war crimes, that is to say murder, and is hereby sentenced to suffer death by shooting. The judge slammed his gavel as the room immediately burst into chatter and a barrage of camera flashes. Okada listened over his headphones as the translation was completed and nodded, showing no emotion as he stared at the floor. Then he raised his head, pulled off his headset, and glanced across the murmuring room at Fuchida. Fuchida felt the pain in his eyes. His blood boiled. March 1946. Seattle Pacific College, Seattle, Washington. Hugging several books under an arm, Jake bit into an apple as he trotted down the steps of a brick building in his overcoat and hat in the chilly morning. Still in a state of wonder, he paused for a moment to look up at the tall, leafless trees. His every need was met as the government was paying his tuition, and every desire he had was being fulfilled. He was swept from the doorstep of death into a hallway of life. Back in September, he stopped by to see his sister, Helen, who happened to work for the president of Seattle Pacific College. The school was set up just before the turn of the century to help train missionaries for the field, but was also fully accredited in the liberal arts. Since she encouraged him to consider the school, he ended up meeting the president, who was only too happy to meet the Doolittle Raider, featured in papers across the city for weeks. Jake wasn't sure if he was going to be up to all the mental stress of college, having been out of school for some years and still recovering at the time, both physically and mentally. When the president offered him a spot and asked when he could start, Jake told him he thought he'd be ready by the winter. Instead, Jake was persuaded to start the very next day. "Hi, Jake," a student said with a wave. "Oh, hi, how you doing?" Jake responded, trying not to spit out chunks of apple as he spoke. It seemed like everyone on campus knew him, and he did his best to remember their names, but still couldn't keep up. Two girls with matching blue scarves smiled as they came closer. "Hello, Jake." Jake politely put his hand to the brim of his fedora. "Good morning, ladies," the girls whispered as soon as they passed by. Attention from women was something he hadn't really thought about when considering school, but now that he'd landed there, he didn't mind it a bit. He ran up the steps into Anderson Hall, a 4-story brick building with twin octagonal towers capped with pointed turrets. He was anxious to finish school and get back to Japan, and was even approved to get his degree in 3 years' time. A bit tired from his relentless speaking engagements, often several times a week, he was excited to get to his next class, among his favourites. Coming into the classroom of students, Jake attempted his best Japanese. "Good morning, Professor Tsuchiyama. How are you today?" With a smile, the professor kept writing kanji on the blackboard, then turned with a bow to Jake and responded in Japanese. "I am very well in the good care of the Lord. Thank you. Please take your seat." It was his favourite class, all right, especially getting to sit next to Florence, a blue-eyed brunette. Jake had become the man on campus and was more than ready to settle down, with the right girl, that is. He still had his good looks, a new car and back pay. But to Florence, he was someone she admired. She gave a coy glance, then pretended not to notice him. Professor Tsuchiyama came up to Jake and laid a set of typewritten pages on his desk, marked with red ink. In English, he said, "It looks good, Jake, but we need to cut it down more if we're going to print this onto a single piece of paper. Then we can start to work on the Japanese translation. Why don't you go over it and give me a new version in 2 days, okay?" Jake nodded. "Yes, sir, sure, I'll get on it." Having told his story countless times in the preceding months, more and more people wanted a copy of it, and an organisation offered to print it up and distribute it for free. On top of that, people wanted a book as well, a daunting task he really wasn't up to, but the school president offered to help. "It's a good title, too. I think it'll intrigue people," the professor said as he turned and walked away. Florence leaned over to see "I Was a Prisoner of Japan" by Jake DeShazer, the Doolittle Bomber. Summer, 1946, Kashiwara. Uchida knelt before a sheet of paper while holding a calligraphy brush in his hand, studying what he had just written. "Are you going out to the property tonight?" Haruko said as she entered the bedroom stacked with belongings against walls. Realizing he was deep in thought, she gently knelt beside him. Shaking his head, he laid down his brush and sighed in frustration. Haruko's eyes scanned the sheet. Mankind must escape from this cycle of hatred generating hatred, of resentment breeding resentment. Only by translating destructive emotions into brotherly love can humanity be saved. Their family of 4 was now crowded into the home of Haruko's sister and brother-in-law, who operated a drugstore in Kashiwara, about 12 miles from where Fuchida grew up. The military was no more, and he had taken what little money he had saved to purchase a small plot of land to grow rice, barley, fruits and vegetables, and to hopefully raise egg-laying chickens as well. But for now, they had no home of their own. When the gardens were done, he would start to build a home for his family. For the moment, Fuchida's struggle was with thoughts and words. Watching his friends in the hospital die a slow, horrid death from the atomic bomb prompted him to shout in his mind, "No more Pearl Harbors, no more Hiroshimas, no more Nagasaki's. The atomic bomb must never be used again. So he vowed to write a book on the way of peace, yet he discovered it a profoundly difficult undertaking. "Look at me," he gently said to Haruko. "I should be dead." He looked down at his half-written page. "A part of me feels I should be with my fallen comrades at Yasukuni, yet I somehow feel I need to say something about how we can live in peace. There must be a way. There must never again be another Pearl Harbor or Hiroshima." He gazed back into Haruko's face. "But I—" He turned his head and looked back down. She tried to smile, but she had nothing to say to ease the pain on his face. Stars punctured the velvet blue night sky. Fuchida positioned his son's hands on a 10-foot wooden pole and then looked straight up from the pole into the sky. A few stakes were tapped into the ground with strings tied between them. "You see it? You see it right there? That's the North Star, Polaris." Yoshia seemed lost as he searched the sky. "My book says that the house should face 15 degrees southeast for maximum sunlight during the winter." Miyako stood a little ways away from her big brother, so Fuchida could use the two of them as a kind of sextant. "But the sun's not out, Daddy," she said. "No, we use the stars. If you follow the 2 stars on the edge of the Big Dipper," Fuchida continued, swinging his arm across the sky, "they point straight to the North Star, right there." "Oh, I see it!" Miyako shouted. "Me too," Yoshia said. "I've done this 100 times on the ocean. You can find your direction anywhere in the world with just the stars." "Daddy," Miyako said, "who put the North Star there?" He looked at her innocent face, then turned his eyes up into the starry sky. His eyes seemed to drift to infinity. It had never dawned on him how useful that star had always been, and that it seemed to have a purpose. It was so steady, so useful, and so beautiful. He, likewise, wondered who put it there. Still gazing at the sky, he said, "I don't know. I don't know who put it there, Miyako." For the first time, he sensed a starting point that might give him some sense of direction to find his bearings once again. A few weeks later, with a hoe over his shoulder, Fuchida stood beside his small, flooded rice paddy and examined a grasshopper perched on his finger. It, too, was also beautiful to him, so perfectly formed and designed. As it leapt off his finger and flew to the ground, he looked up and around at the trees, the birds, and the sky. Everything in nature seemed to fit together in such harmony, in a way that only God could do it. Yet it all remained a mystery. Haruko sat a ways away on the porch of their half-built home, smiling as Yoshia, holding a chicken, chased Miyako, who screamed and laughed, with Litty barking at their heels. Fuchida reached down and pulled up a single rice shoot and carefully studied it as the wet mud dribbled through his fingers. He could plant seeds and water them, but he couldn't make them grow.